In this news roundup of the week on 30th of September 2022, Putin draws his red line and dares the West to cross it by formally annexing 4 regions of Ukraine. The UK Truss government's mini-budget explodes in their faces and gives Labour real hope of regaining power. And controversial and Eurosceptic right-winger Georgia Meloni wins Italy's election, the latest populist wave that seems potentially to be sweeping Europe. My name is Mallen Baker. This is the Mallen Baker Show. The Nord Stream 1 and Nord Stream 2 pipelines were hit by sabotage this week. It led to the leaking of vast quantities of methane into the atmosphere, as much global warming potential as a small country in one blow. This satellite map shows the methane leakage in pretty dramatic fashion. The scale of the event makes it almost certain it could only have been carried out by a state-level actor. Putin, of course, said that it was Anglo-Saxon powers that did it, a claim without evidence or, given recent track record of blatant demonstrable lying, credibility. Various agents presume the moves were made, in fact, by Russia, but governments have mostly not been quick to go there until there's solid proof, because there's a question about how big a line would have been crossed if it turned out that it was indeed Russian state action that was responsible. If a country bombs a piece of critical infrastructure, is that an act of war? Well, what about a pipeline delivering a resource exclusively from the bombing nation? One it had already turned off and which has no value if there's no agreement to resume supply. Might be commercial mischief and malpractice. Would it be an act of war? Ursula von der Leyen, head of the European Commission, said that any deliberate sabotage would get, quote, the strongest possible response, which is handily undefined. But the realisation that's apparently sinking in this week is that Russia might be on the verge of declaring war anyway, and this could be the first clue of how it will escalate. The sabotage of the pipelines directed attention to other elements of critical infrastructure that line the oceans and the waterways that could similarly be targeted to create maximum chaos. For instance, here's a map of all the major underwater internet cables that connect the UK, Europe, America and the world. Some are important specifically for financial transactions and markets, and although it might look like there are quite a few different cables, not so many that they couldn't be hit all at once. The UK's most senior military officer said in December last year that such a strike would immediately and potentially catastrophically impact the economy, which, as we know, that's the government's job. If internet cables begin getting sabotaged, again, will that be an act of war? Well, surely. At that point, you're talking major national harm, existential risk. As long ago as August last year, the British intelligence community was warning about having detected unusual behaviour by Russian submarines, apparently targeting one such cable for unspecified attention. And years before that, back in 2015, around the time of the annexation of Crimea, the New York Times reported military sources talking about a spike in similar activity. Now, other targets also present themselves. The pipeline from Norway to Europe would be a critical failure point. However tough a time Europe's going to have this winter, it would be catastrophically worse if that one was taken out. Not the sort of thing that would be ambiguous. That would be an act of war. Would Russia really cross that line? Well, this week Russia concluded its transparently sham referenda as predicted, jumping immediately to declaring that the invaded regions are now part of Russia. In a speech today announcing the annexation, Putin said, "The people of Ukraine's territories have chosen to be with their people, the motherland." This has several implications. One, Russia can send its newly conscripted troops there. Conscripts are not legally allowed to be sent outside of Russia to fight. Indeed, the nightmare scenario for some of the Ukrainian men in those territories is that they now get conscripted into the Russian army, sent out as cannon fodder for their countrymen to shoot at. 2. According to Russia's constitution, the Russian state is not allowed to cede territory in any treaty once it has been claimed for Russia. which means there can be no peace talks to give them back to Ukraine. Putin declared in his speech that he was ready for peace talks with Ukraine, but of course there could be no question of giving back any of the territory. So a rather one-sided set of talks that is unlikely to appeal to Zelensky. 3. If Putin's plan is, as I speculated last week, to seek to scare the West off supporting the taking back of the territory with the threat that if their weapons are used against it, Russia will take it as an act of war, then we are facing a very dangerous moment right now. If Putin's position is bluff, it's going to be called within days, probably hours of his announcement. Ukraine isn't going to win the war anytime soon, but they are certainly likely to make some important and highly visible advances. Indeed, even as I shoot this video, there are confirmed reports of Ukrainian troops in Yampol, with Russian forces being surrounded and multiple video sources suggesting that they are cutting and running. The humiliation of another setback, just moments after Russia has made its big pitch, really would give it nowhere to hide, if that is what's to happen. And all of this takes place against the backdrop of what by all accounts has been a humiliating, bungled mobilisation, with large numbers of people being called up who didn't remotely fit the criteria of who was supposed to be in the frame, some of whom got sent back, some of whom didn't. This happened particularly in the regions where pressure has been highest because they're some way away from Moscow and considered less sensitive. So in the Republic of Dagestan, the regional governor had a video go viral on pro-Kremlin social media channels where he was reacting to military recruitment officers filmed driving around the streets with loudspeakers telling all the men to report. Governor Sergei Melikov said, "What kind of idiots are these? Are you morons?" In case you think it's all fake news, Vladimir Putin himself acknowledged on late Thursday that there had been mistakes, saying that those who had been taken regardless of deferrals or exemptions should be sent home. This caused a degree of cognitive dissonance for some commentators. So, for instance, Andrei Medvedev, a prominent pro-Kremlin, pro-war journalist and member of the Moscow City Duma, he published an imaginative conspiracy theory on his Telegram channel. Let me put forward a theory. What if Western intelligence agencies worked with soldiers of the military registration and enlistment office in advance and infiltrated the entire country with their agents? And now, literally in sleeper mode, they are rushing ahead because they understand that they are setting the stage for mass unrest in the country for a social explosion. Or, when you do things in a really big hurry at large scale, you make huge amounts of mistakes with unintended consequences. That's a more conventional explanation. And speaking of big moves with major unintended consequences, a week later, the Truss and Kwarteng mini-budget continues to dominate the news and political discourse in the UK. Kwarteng's announcement last Friday of various measures that had mostly already been well trailed, alongside a couple of eye-catching additions such as abolishing the 45% top rate of tax, led to market turmoil. Some said this was the natural response to a reckless move of announcing huge spending while also cutting taxes. Others said that the markets were overreacting due to world events making them more febrile than usual. But there were rather more voices giving the first of those two versions. The yield of 30-year gilts, how the government borrows, had risen by 200 percentage points in a week, which is just not heard of for a major developed country. Pension funds were hours from bankruptcy in some cases. It wasn't clear that planned gilt auctions could even go ahead, raising the prospect the government wouldn't be able to fund itself. In the event, the Bank of England stepped in, saying it would buy gilts in whatever quantity was needed to restore order, which it largely did. Since then, Prime Minister Liz Truss, Chancellor Kwasi Kwarteng have been following the never apologise, never explain playbook, refusing to agree that there had been any mistakes made and making clear their determination to continue. That will set them up for a, shall we say, more dynamic than usual Conservative Party conference next week. This week, it certainly nicely set up the opposition leader Keir Starmer and his shadow Chancellor Rachel Reeves in pointing to the chaos and framing themselves now as the party of sound finance and economic prudence. Indeed, The Guardian unable to conceal its glee, put it this way. With the Tories looking like deaf cult muppets, all the Labour leader needed to do in the big speech was not sound like a complete half-wit. Mission accomplished. Even if Starmer's not known for setting a conference hall alight with fiery rhetoric, his party handled the opportunity well enough to see the initial polls trending significantly in their favour. Polls now show Labour 17 percentage points ahead, the largest lead they've had, and if it were to be replicated in a general election, it would be the sort of seismic shift that was represented by the first Blair government, which swept John Major aside to take power with a large majority. Now, it won't be replicated, the lead will tighten, nevertheless. Suddenly people were looking at the Labour conference as the likely gathering place for a government in waiting. That hasn't been true, frankly, since Blair in 1996, and it wasn't true of Starmer's Labour until precisely this week. Now, Starmer made his big pitch of a conference, and there was a lot about economic responsibility, but the major focus was on energy. Labour, he said, would create a giant national clean energy company, Great British Energy, that would have £2 billion of seed funding and would develop all of those needed but commercially risky sources that the country wants and the private sector would be slow to provide. Not only that, it would be publicly owned, the statement that probably got the biggest cheer of the speech. In that, it would be based on certain examples of nationally owned energy companies, for example, France's EDF, owned by the French government and responsible for running and building its nuclear power stations. Unkind people pointed out that EDF has shown itself to be something of a basket case in recent years, inefficient to the degree that many of its nuclear power stations have been out of commission just when they were needed the most. But at least Labour was presenting a vision that could be said to be on the scale of the change that might be presented as meeting the needs of the moment. Now, of course, maybe the Conservatives have their own big ideas on the energy front to launch next week at their conference. On a purely political basis, it doesn't matter, because all the commentators will be talking about then will be the economic crisis and the botched budget. One big idea that Business and Energy Secretary Jacob Rees-Mogg did trail in Parliament last week was that of hydrogen, with a mooted wide-scale rollout to replace natural gas for home heating. Now, I've expressed my scepticism on that suggestion in the past. Well, just in time for their conference comes the news of a major new review of 30 studies, which has concluded that, indeed, hydrogen is unsuitable for use in home heating. Meanwhile, China, which as we know is currently emitting more carbon into the air than anyone else, is nevertheless progressing on its own alternatives, given that it's promised that its emissions will peak before 2030. So this week we saw an announcement that China would be focusing on 3 areas for high quality energy infrastructure. One of those areas, according to Song Wen, the country's main energy regulator, is to steadily promote gigantic wind and solar bases, particularly in the Gobi Desert and other arid regions, as well as hydropower bases in southwestern China. According to Bloomberg, China's rapid buildup of clean energy is pulling in a lot more copper from the global market, which is balancing out the slump in its normal use in other sectors such as housing. At the Labour conference, again, Keir Starmer said that someone had to become the global leader in renewables, so why not Britain? And someone had to become the global leader in small-scale nuclear, so why not Britain? Other European and US politicians have asked similarly rhetorical questions about their own nations, rather missing the fact that such opportunities don't sit around waiting for you to get around to them. China, at the same time as polluting at the fastest rate, is also putting itself in prime position to sell us the technologies to end the age of pollution. Every indication is that the US, the UK and the European Union are being way too slow off the blocks. Mind you, the EU technocrats have had other things on their mind. The prospect of a right-wing populist wave sweeping across the continent was raised this week with the much-expected victory in the Italian election for Georgia Meloni and her Brothers of Italy party. This was the prompt for a certain amount of excitable commentary, which has focused in on the country's history with Mussolini. The phrase hard right is commonly used, but those are the more restrained ones. Left-wing site The Canary goes straight for fascism. Likewise, here was The Conversation, describing it as the return of fascism. German weekly Der Spiegel said, for the first time, the neo-fascists are taking control of a government in a large EU country. Many didn't feel they could stretch that far on the current available information. They used instead the suggestive phrase about the victorious party being, quote, rooted in fascism. We'll talk about that in a moment, but certainly Meloni's form on Euroscepticism, her association with the likes of Viktor Orban, had the EU tempted into indiscretion. So Commission President Ursula von der Leyen commented before the election, if things go in a difficult direction, and I've spoken about Hungary and Poland, we have the tools. Not unreasonably, that was taken by a number of Italian politicians as unwelcome interference by the EU in its democratic processes, effectively telling Italians who they should, more specifically who they should not, be voting for, with a hint of underlying menace. And this rather highlights the difficulty for the EU as an attempted continent-wide superstate that isn't actually formally a federation. And with huge diversity amongst its constituent parts, the idea you can establish a common direction of travel is arguably on fragile foundations. And with Sweden and now Italy seeing populists rise to prominence, if not outright power, those foundations are about to be tested. And it matters a lot with Italy, with the 9th largest economy in the world, and with the status of having been one of the founders and moving forces of the entire European project. Meloni does not have a majority alone, of course. She succeeded largely for three reasons. One, the parties of the right were able to form a stable coalition, which meant that in the first past the post constituencies, they put up just one candidate, whereas the parties of the centre and the left failed to be able to collaborate to that degree, so they fractured their vote in those constituencies. Two, she had refused to join the national government coalition that came before, giving her the sense of being a fresh, different force in the country that was very much jaded with recent political failures. And three, enough of the population discounted the accusations that they were akin to fascism. They either didn't feel that what they saw that when they looked at her, or they were confident that with the modern system and the broad coalition that she had to be a part of, that it was a long way from the circumstances where true fascism would be allowed to flourish. The Brothers of Italy won 26% of the vote, up from a tiny 5% in the previous 2018 election. That put the party in a strongly dominant position in their coalition, where the League got 9% and Berlusconi's Forza Italia 8%. But what about that charge of fascism? As someone who hasn't followed Italian politics closely, I'm interested in the reality that can be hard to get to through all the rhetoric. After all, I've seen a number of mainstream figures get labelled as things like far-right or alt-right by left-wing commentators who are nothing of the sort, so those labels get thrown around rather easily. So I look to the trenchant critics to see what substance they have for making that association. Here's The Guardian: a danger to Italy and the rest of Europe. And this was the case they made against her. One, she admires Viktor Orban, whose Hungarian rule was declared by the European Parliament earlier this month to be no longer a full democracy. And that appreciation is apparently mutual. Two, the party has attracted militants from other parties, although the author conceded that Meloni had expelled troublemakers from her party. And then three, and I find this rather puzzling, although Meloni denies she is a fascist, the author says, her party's lineage can be traced back to neo-fascist movements, and this fits with a pattern of such parties, quote, that have gone to lengths to detoxify and soften their image, declaring their opposition to anti-Semitism, racism, and the historical fascist experience. Well, that's a damned if you don't, damned if you do point, isn't it? Surely you would demand of such parties that they did exactly those things. You'd condemn them for not doing so. So arguing that they're just being sneaky and clever by doing exactly those things, I mean, if that's the best argument, I'm not entirely surprised that Italians might have discounted it as political rhetoric. And 4, Meloni's accused of dog whistling to her neo-fascist ancestors by using the slogan God, Homeland, Family. He writes this: "She did it in 2019, screaming from the stage at a rally in San Giovanni, 'I am Georgia, I am a woman, I am a mother, I am Italian, I am a Christian.'" Okay, well at this point you end up concluding that whether this brand of right-wing populism will be disastrous or not for Italy in its current position, the case that it's actual fascism doesn't seem to be strongly made. And no, that is not an endorsement in any way of someone who I don't really know. It's just looking for actual evidence and not really finding any. Add to that the fact that, unlike her coalition partners, Meloni, who was previously friendly to Russia, is a staunch supporter of the defence of Ukraine with the current war. And the fact that the party's 20-year tradition has apparently been based on the primacy of democratic processes and has never challenged them, it's hard to see the extreme left narrative as holding up. However, in other respects, Meloni has all the trappings of the right-wing populist, strong anti-illegal immigration in a country, of course, that has been on the front line of such inflows, often attached to inflammatory rhetoric, very much in favour of traditional marriage, heterosexuality, anti-LGBT, although she said that she won't roll back provisions for gay marriage. She is against abortion, but again has said that she won't abolish Italy's abortion law. Obviously, you can add to all of that the relatively easy anti-woke positions, which have gained her the admiration of American Republicans. But so far, she hasn't played up the firebrand role. When she was elected, in her victory speech, she said, "This is the time for being responsible. If we are called to govern this nation, we will do it for everyone. We will do it for all Italians. We will do it with the aim of uniting the people." This doesn't sound like a brash populist speech from someone preparing to tear up all of the rules. And indeed, she herself argues her party is now more akin to the UK Conservatives than anything you would label as far right, although she might be reconsidering that comparison given this week's events. She quotes the late British philosopher Roger Scruton as one of her influences. In a country that turns quickly against politicians who struggle to deliver in the face of a fragmented political system, she may in any case see her star burning less brightly very quickly once she has to get down to the business of governing. Indeed, in interviews, one of the reasons why Italian voters weren't much worried about her was because of a cynical belief that governments come, governments go, they don't last long, whatever happens now, it'll all change soon. A view that makes sense when you consider the party's rapid rise, which means it brings with it very little experience of actual governing, so a high likelihood it will make some serious mistakes. Especially with the powerful maverick figures she's sharing her coalition with. The Foreign Affairs website said that although Meloni might long-term harm Italy's democracy, in the short term it thought she would provide stability by being so much stronger than her more disruptive partners, both of whom are supporters of Putin. Certainly, former left Prime Minister Matteo Renzi seemed relatively relaxed when he said this: "Personally, I was against Georgia Meloni. I'm not her best friend. We are rivals, but she is not a danger to democracy. The idea there is a risk of fascism in Italy is absolutely fake news." If that's the case, and I haven't seen a lot to suggest otherwise, the reaction amongst the mainstream press in some parts of Europe and the US should be seriously called out. In polarised times, demonising your opponents may feel like it's become a standard thing to do. It doesn't help the rest of us understand what's really happening in the world and what it means. What happens in the next year in Italy, particularly between Italy and the EU, is going to be well worth watching. Alright, no short thought this week, we are out of time, but one YouTube update that some of my commenters might need to know about. We've complained sometimes that YouTube deletes comments or doesn't allow comments, according to some formula that isn't remotely obvious. Separate to that, I have asked commenters to be polite to each other. I've often struggled with how and when to act on that request, where to draw the line, how to be consistent about something that's a grey area. Well, YouTube is trialling new functionality. At some point in the future, it's going to start telling you when it has removed your comment and why. Saying something like, "We've discovered that comments you've left may violate community guidelines," and then quoting the part of it that it thinks you violated, e.g. spam, deceptive practices and scam policies. If you keep leaving comments like this, you may lose your ability to comment or even have your channel terminated, it will tell you. In the video where this was introduced to the content creators community, it was described as including offensive and abusive language. Now, in one sense, I welcome that. If it means that commenters get transparent feedback as to why their comments are being removed, and they can therefore avoid doing those things, that is preferable to it just happening with no explanation. Also, it may challenge some people's perceptions, because people are often quick to presume political intent. Well, it may be that more often it's to do with some other factors, such as language, that is considered by the algorithms to be abusive, rightly or wrongly. I personally have no problem with YouTube enforcing a no abusive or rude language policy. There is no political idea or argument that is censored by being polite. I rather suspect, however, that there are rather more reasons why such comments get removed. I wonder just how transparent this is all going to be. I guess we're going to find out. Anyway, I thought I should give you a heads up as to what's coming. Maybe some of those commenters you could practice from today, not using abusive language. For everything else, we'll just discover how it's going to play out at some point in the weeks or months to come. My thanks as always go to the supporters of this channel on Patreon. As you know, I could not commit the time that it takes to produce these videos without that support. If you would like to add your support for the independent, fact-focused, non-ideological content I aim to produce here, please head on over to patreon.com/Mallen Baker. It is always appreciated. Either way, have a great week. My name's Mallen Baker. This is the Mallen Baker Show. Thanks for watching this video. If you liked it, please share with anyone else you think would also enjoy it. Word of mouth is really important to us. And if you've not subscribed yet, what are you waiting for? As the saying goes, that subscribe button won't smash itself.